also want to start by recognizing that Carleton University campus is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence reaches back to time immemorial. We note that Carleton acknowledges that it has a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. As we at NACOCO organize around anti-racism and decolonization, we must examine and reflect the ways in which the university's presence on this land upholds colonialism and reproduces dispossession and violence for Indigenous peoples. For those of us who are settlers, we must commit to learning more about ways we can uphold conditions of the treaties that were intended to govern this land. We commit to unlearning and examining our own internal biases and racist practices, and to unlearning the harmful ways we have been socialized into a system of white supremacy. NACOCO is a platform for public intellectuals, academics, social movements, and organizations who share our vision. The journal is open access with no fees to submit, publish, or read. Hosted by the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University, the journal NACOCO offers a space for emerging and established scholars to publish and engage in discussions about their work on Africa and the African diaspora. Published annually, articles and contributions to the journal are peer-reviewed. Submissions should be robust, clearly written, and accessible to academic and non-academic readerships alike. NACOCO aims to be a site for such important conversations related to Africa, the African diaspora, and the continent's relationship with the rest of the world. Our speakers today are going to discuss the extent to which processes of militarization on the African continent are driven by the economic and strategic interests of intervening nations. In other words, it is a chance to revisit what Pádraig Carmody has termed the new Scramble for Africa, first in his 2011 title of that name, which was followed by a revised edition in 2016. It's important for us to note that this discussion was initially planned as part of a call for papers for a special issue of NACOCO that was first sent out 2 years ago, just before our lives were all seriously impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and shutdowns. Since then, NACOCO has published 2 volumes, the last being volume 9 from 2021, a special issue in honor of the late Pius Edesanmi, the Institute of African Studies former director, who tragically died in Ethiopian Airlines crash of March 10th, 2019. That edition is entitled The Africanist Public Intellectuals, Progressive Politics, and Youth Agency in a Digital Age. A forthcoming special issue of NACOCO is also scheduled to come out this May. That's on the politics and cultural economy of humor and stand-up comedy in Africa. While previous NACOCO editions remained in progress over the last 2 years, those of us working on this call for papers, which I should really point out is Feroz Manji, Richard Raber, and myself, with some help from Daniel Tubb as well. We became severely sidetracked by our new realities, and we did actually receive some proposed abstracts and draft submissions, but we felt the topic did not receive the kind of attention it deserved, largely because of the ways the pandemic had impacted people's lives. So we're reissuing that call for papers alongside the discussion today. Just before we hear from the speakers, it's worth offering a tiny bit of context. First, in discussing this topic among our editorial board, there's been debate about the use of the term neoliberalism, whether it should be in the title, because it was suggested that it has not ever been disconnected from militarism at its core since its commencement, whether you periodize it with its inception in 1973 with the Chilean coup, or at any time prior. And in fact, if you look at the era of classical liberalism, in which figures such as Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and David Ricardo contributed, they all actually were inherently tied to imperialistic militarist projects. Secondly, there was discussion about the applicability of the term the new scramble, which might be subject to some of the flattening and universalizing or distorting a distortion of diverse social and historical contexts, and for downplaying the agency of African states in managing their relationships with foreign powers. So this in turn forces us to reflect on the nature of the current global capitalist system and its internal contradictions. Nevertheless, despite those reservations, we maintain that there's something new to this present moment, and we believe the levels of militarization on the continent and the ongoing, increasingly severe conflicts are not getting the kind of attention they deserve, and the many lives lost, displaced, and traumatized also are more deserving of more attention than has been offered. We find this particularly disturbing in this moment in which the war in Ukraine has rapidly come to dominate the news streams. Without belittling the terrors that are taking place in Eastern Europe, we researchers of Africa see how little attention is offered to the levels of warfare and displacement on the continent that far exceed what is taking place in Europe, while media sources are nearly silent on it. And I think last year, 2021, there was a record of at least 29 million people currently displaced on the African continent as a result of conflict and war. Comparatively, in Ukraine, we've got about 15,000 who have lost their lives so far, which is horrendous, and 7 million displaced. But even here, we see that Africans living in Ukraine were often stuck without offers of prioritized refugee claims offered to white Ukrainians. So we see this ongoing racism in the global political economy. Comparatively, as many as 500,000 people have died from war and famine in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia over the past 16 months. Nigeria's conflict with Islamic insurgencies has killed 350,000 people by the end of 2020. And these are only the immediate effects. The Lancet study, a Lancet study shows that 3 times more children died in Africa between 1995 and 2015 as a result of conflicts than the number who were actually killed in conflicts themselves, for many reasons. With this in mind, we wish to give the mic over first to Professor Pádraig Carmody from Trinity College Dublin, who's graciously offering his time to discuss these realities and the degree to which the notion of a new scramble assists us in understanding the current conjuncture. He'll speak for about 15 minutes and followed by an interjection from Zubairu Wai from the University of Toronto, Scarborough campus. And I'll come back to that following Pádraig's introductory remarks. Thank you so much for being here, everybody.
Share a PowerPoint here. So I cast my kind of net quite widely. I'm going to offer some provocations, I hope, which will kind of stimulate discussion. I think for us, Manji is going to be a discussant as well of this. So just to start out, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the other so-called great powers should be interested in conflict because it presents security threats or challenges for them. And recently there's been more work done on the kind of geocultural dimensions of external engagements and interventions. So reinforcing the geopolitical identity or self-understandings of states or actors within states. How do they understand themselves, their morality, what their purpose in the world is, if you like. And these combination of interests coalesce together into different geopolitical codes, which you could argue different states apply to different world regions to kind of assess their interests in those places. For the US, for the last number of decades, the kind of geopolitical code for Africa has largely been centered on Africa as a space of charity or security threat. For China, the geopolitical code has been different, with geoeconomics, I'd argue, to the fore. So, you know, I think in 2008, around 30% of China's total oil imports came from Africa. So there was a very strong geopolitical or geoeconomic motivation in terms of securing access to resources, and also through time access to markets, such that China now runs a trade surplus with the continent. But that's changing. I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, if we're thinking about meta trends in African geopolitics, I think there's a couple of kind of meta trends. I mean, there are many, but we can identify a couple that I want to highlight. Susan Roberts, Anna Secor, and Matt Spark have a great paper on neoliberal geopolitics, which was written in response to the US and British invasion of Iraq, where they talk about the way in which the military intervention prefigured a radical program of market reform to make Iraq as completely a free market economy as it could be. And so we can talk about these issues, the relationship between securitization and neoliberalization. I think maybe the causality runs a little bit different in African or some African cases from neoliberalism to securitization. That is, that the inequalities generated by neoliberalism, the poverty and exclusion associated with it, necessitates or at least brings forth the imperative of securitization. China, as you all know, I'm sure, is Africa's largest trading partner and has been, until recent years, increasing levels of investment. But if you look at the statistics in the last couple of years, what we see something changing, and in particular, the lending through the Belt and Road Initiative from 2016 onwards really collapses, and reduced economic growth from 2014, reduced commodity prices from 2014 also fed into reduced economic growth. There have been problems with some very high profile, iconic mega projects like the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway. We can talk more about that. Together, these have fed into declines in Chinese foreign investment. But at the same time, then, there's a need for a rebalancing of Chinese engagement because China has adopted a more assertive international stance in recent years in relation to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Australia, and so on. After the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, Chinese officials talked about the need for ants to protect the elephant. That's the idea that smaller, often African countries might be rallied around China to protect it from the kind of Western criticism that followed that event. And maybe we're seeing a kind of reprise of that. But in some recent work, Lina Bendabella has argued that we're seeing a greater importance of soft power from China in response to these developments on the continent. So greater importance for aid, education and training, exchanges. And she talks about productive relational power, which is the idea that actors in international relations co-constitute each other. They shape each other's interests through these networks of interaction and the creation of associated political opportunity structures. Okay, so are we seeing a shift from geoeconomics to geopolitics in China's engagement, or is it more complex? I'll talk a little bit about that. And are we seeing a move from what might be called a positive to a negative new scramble for Africa? What do I mean by that? I don't mean that the earlier surge of foreign investment and trade was necessarily positive in terms of its impacts, but it was about going to the continent looking to engage economically, if you like, versus the idea of a negative scramble for Africa, where it becomes about containment and securitization, and the geoeconomics becomes less important, if you like. Now, which of these trends eventuate partly depends, of course, on trends in global commodity prices, which account for the vast majority of African exports. And we've seen these surge in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, ecological scarcity may continue to bite and drive those prices higher over the medium to longer term as well. But we can't really predict what will happen. Okay, in terms of how China is exercising its power internationally, I'm developing a concept with a colleague here at Trinity, Carol Newman and Jim Murphy and John Rand around what we call Chinese web power. And there's a debate in the literature about the extent to which China's extraterritorial engagements are centrally controlled versus diffuse actors undertaking their own agendas. So do state-owned corporations kind of play to the tune of the central government or the Chinese Communist Party? And we're trying to recast the debate on this and think about power as both centralized and diffuse. So this is the idea of the kind of web, if you like, where there's a central coordinating agency in the form of the Chinese Communist Party in the center, which is linked up with these multiple nodes, such as banks, state-owned enterprises, so-called sometimes private Chinese firms, to create this kind of web power. And Sean Breslin, in a recent book, talks about the idea of bounded autonomy. That is, that Chinese-based or centered actors may have autonomy, but up to certain limits. They must operate within certain limits that the state or the Communist Party set. An example of that might be a company like Huawei, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which in theory or notionally is a private company, but if you look at the actuality, it's 99% controlled in terms of its share of voting rights by a trade union associated with the Communist Party. So notionally, it's an independent kind of private entity. In practice, it's imbricated in these webs and networks of Communist Party power in China. As China's engagements have increased, this has put pressure on the traditional Chinese stance of non-interference, and we've seen some kind of revision to this with some Chinese scholars talking about the necessity of creative engagement. So the idea that if you're bringing development or peace or you're helping those processes in Africa or elsewhere, that's not interference, those things are positive. And so engagement is different from interference, although I guess you could argue the case on that as to whether that's true or not. We've also seen, I mentioned this idea of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, this more assertive stance of China, supposedly to befit its major country or so-called major country status now. Again, we can talk about that in the discussions, but overall we argue China's influence is primarily economic, and if you look at the graph there, or the graphic on the right-hand side, we divide these areas of influence into what we call production realms, okay, around production, labor, finance, innovation, infrastructure, and importantly, standards. But again, I'm happy to talk in more detail about this. Web power is an idea that can be applied to China, but also, of course, to other so-called great powers. So I'm not trying to essentialize or kind of reify Chinese power, but it does have some distinctive characteristics. Just in terms of the aid vector, this is a quote from a document which was issued early last year about China's international development cooperation in the new era from the State Council. You can read it there. Talking about the unprecedented level of interconnection and interdependence, building or binding countries into a global community of shared future, and that China's international development cooperation in this new era has a more profound philosophical basis, clearer goals, which puts people first and prioritizes the protection of life. So again, China kind of recasting itself maybe as a kind of more humanitarian actor and giving this aid vector of engagement a greater kind of pride of place or importance in its discourse. We know that China had its first military base established in Djibouti overseas, something that it said it would never do. Of course, it's claimed that it's a kind of logistical facility for the Chinese Navy, but again, we can dispute that perhaps. There's also talk of new bases being established, perhaps one in Equatorial Guinea, and there may be other ones coming down the pipeline in other parts of the world. So China's rise as a kind of global power, some people have argued, has necessitated the securitization of supply chains for critical natural resources in particular, but also of trading routes, in the Red Sea and elsewhere. If we look at US engagement, Again, the US is only meant to have one military base, again in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier, leased off the French government, I think. But if you look at, Nick Turse produced this map a couple of years ago showing military bases, camps, military camps. So these are non-permanent facilities, tented facilities, for example, drone camps, and so on. So you can see these are scattered across much of the continent, particularly focused on the Sahelian region, and there are about apparently 6,000 US troops on the continent again. If we're looking at why we see this kind of patterning, and things have changed pretty rapidly in relation to US trade with the continent. So this is a graph showing US exports to Africa in blue, and then exports, African exports to the US in red. You can see African exports essentially fall off a cliff from 2014 onwards. This is partly an artifact of the commodity price bust. So the US importing less in value terms because the price of oil in particular declined rapidly, but it's also reflective of other things like the shale oil and gas revolution in the US, which has essentially made that country energy independent. And so I think we're seeing a reversion to the previous kind of geopolitical stance or code of securitizing exclusion. Okay, and just to end, I think Toby was mentioning in his opening remarks there about the underplaying of African agency, and I just want to open this up for discussion. And I suppose it depends, African or any other agency for that matter, whether it exists or not, depends on the definition. So actors are arguably co-constituted. They respond to particular opportunity structures, and we're all programmed in terms of our socialization, education, and genetics as well, maybe to respond in particular ways. Other people define agency as the intention to do something, and I think that's actually maybe a better definition. It's not that African or other actors are powerless, particularly state elites, far from it, but anyway, we can debate about the nature and impacts of agency. Ian Taylor noted in a book chapter back in 2015 the importance of so-called negative agency around corruption, crime, or illegitimate regime maintenance. So again, agency tends to have a kind of positive connotation in the literature, but agency also may be used for illegitimate or nefarious purposes. And just in terms of the new geopolitical reconfigurations we're seeing, I think, continuity and change. So the strategy of extroversion for most African political elites remains in place. The extent to which they have agency, if we accept that term, partly depends on their extroversion portfolios. But within that context, we're still seeing, I think, the increasing importance of China on the continent. So even as Chinese trade with Africa fell during the COVID pandemic, it fell by less than it did with Europe. So we're still seeing a relative rise in the importance of China, even as loan values decrease, foreign investment has decreased, and so on. And so arguably, we're still seeing a deepening of relations of dependence, but their geographic reorientation towards the so-called global East. So I'll leave it there, Toby. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pádraig. This is fantastic. And so I'm passing it over to Zuba. And I thought I'd mention that, in 2014, Zuba wrote an article in the Review of African Political Economy, which posed the question then of whether we were witnessing a state of liberal peace, empire, or post-colonial imperialism on the continent. And he described it as a quest to restructure the world and impose a liberal peace on it, as something that incarnates a new imperial moment that has seen the intensification of militaristic modes of pacification and control, violence both in its structural and militaristic forms, is the property of the imperial present, produced and managed through strategic complexes of the liberal imperial order. The contradictions of this system are staggering. He says, while seeking to outlaw violence and conflict that it does not sanction or are not waged in the service of its ethos, it claims the right to intervene and wage wars in the interests of its agendas and to enforce its will and further its objectives, as well as seeking to unite the world under a single imperial authority. The liberal world order is simultaneously fragmenting in ways that are not only generating insecurities, misery, and further violence for the majority of the world's populations, but are also threatening the very survival of the system that produces it. Now, this is a very apt statement for what we've seen since that time. At the same time, I think, as Pádraig has shown, that we have an increasingly more complicated context. So I'm wondering, Zuba, if you can follow up on, from that article and tell us what we should be paying attention to at this time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Toby, for inviting this, for initiating this conversation, but also for inviting this presentation, right? I mean, Toby is good people. He has always been very kind and supportive of my work. And I mean, he is like a very good colleague to have. And thank you all for making the time to attend this talk. You know, Toby, I think my assessment that you just read is still kind of stand, except for the fact that unlike Pádraig, I don't actually look at the rise of China as imperial in the African context at all. If anything, I think that China is creating an opportunity for Africans to be able to engage differently with the world. But that's something I'll get to at the end of the presentation. What I want to do is to approach this from a little bit of historical, but also theoretical perspective. So I want to start by saying from the very onset that from an African situatedness and from the perspective of the global South more broadly, neoliberalism has always been a violent and exploitative enterprise. As an ideology of economic organization, it emerged both as a crisis-generating and crisis-displacement mechanism. By crisis-generating and crisis-displacement, I refer to the instrument, the technique, the strategy, the practice of systematically producing or systematic production of crisis and its displacement as a major constitutive element of neoliberal functionality. What I am saying, in other words, is that crisis generation is constitutive and instrumental, not incidental to neoliberalism. We all know how neoliberalism emerged as a strategy for overcoming the crisis of overaccumulation in the 1970s. Peter Gowan has shown how the United States gamble of a triple strategy of high oil pricing, the removal of capital controls, the institution of high interest rates in the 70s constituted the first attempt to overcome a situation of stagflation and a situation of overaccumulation in place and put in place a new international financial and monetary arrangement that will recenter it as the dominant player, giving it far greater influence over international monetary financial relations of the world that it had more than it had enjoyed under the Bretton Woods arrangement. The system, however, Gowan insists, operated on the logic of crisis as it systematically generated balance of payment problems, financial and debt crisis in the South, while presaging neoliberal measures as a solution. Through this internationally provoked crisis, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank acquired new roles as major players. From then on, a powerful US Treasury with unparalleled powers over the World Bank and the IMF forced poor countries and poorer states in the South into compliance with Washington's preferred economic policies through credit manipulation, debt management practices, and severe austerity measures. And I just have to say this, I was in Sierra Leone going to school in the 80s when structural adjustment came to that society. And I know how the food on our plates disappeared. I know how our families had to struggle. There was this kid that I went to school with who basically had to quit school to go help take care of the family. So through structural adjustment policies, the IMF and the World Bank will open up Southern and especially African economies to neoliberal governance mechanisms that enforced, among other things, privatization, trade liberalization, the regulation of capital, the erosion of public sector and national control over policies, democratic control over resources and policy making and so forth. And I mean, everybody here, at least I hope, understand this history. Right. So thus from the very onset, Southern states were made to bear disproportionately the cost of an emerging neoliberal mode of global capital accumulation. For example, under the weight of structural adjustment conditionalities and a crippling debt burden, not only forced Southern states to abandon domestic commitment to certain status redistributive programs, rolling back of spending in such vital areas as healthcare, food, education, transport, infrastructure, and the elimination of subsidies on key sectors such as agriculture, but also the pursuit, and this is important for the conversation about geopolitics, the collectivist international economic and political agendas as the growing pressures and demand of debt repayment, which made focus on domestic economic and socio-political issues a priority, forced Southern states to divert attention from the collectivist third worldist projects and which had been that they had spearheaded underpinned by the logics of Bandung. In another sense, neoliberalism was also, in fact, a strategy at suppressing these third worldist solidarity politics that, like I said, was encapsulated in the spirit of Bandung, the tricontinental and non-alignment. And it was precisely in the context, and this is the point that I was making, like some of my friends dropping out of school. And so in Sierra Leone, 5 years later, after neoliberalism, there was a civil war. Precisely in the context of neoliberal assault and imposition that conflicts in Africa in the 90s and elsewhere in the South emerged. These conflicts would provide the opportunity for the rearticulation of another liberal interventionist policy that is known as liberal peace, which will, among other things, seek to reinforce neoliberal governance mechanisms as part of its operational ethos. Emergent in the 90s as a liberal ideological interventionist agenda, the initial focus of liberal interventionism was the transformation of conflicts through liberal peace building and state building strategies that involve, among other things, the securitization of development and the restructuring of states and societies along liberal ideologies of governance and the policy preferences dictated from the global north and promoted by their aid agencies, global governance institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and other strategic actors. Elsewhere, and this is the article that Toby was referring to, I have characterized this liberal peace agenda as a neo-imperialistic posture potentiated by a liberal will to power and domination, that it is a desire or an attempt at restructuring global power and imposing a liberal imperial order on the world. However, that this desire does not transform the constitutive violence and hierarchical form of power into a decentered and deterritorialized phenomena, as Hart and Negri, for example, problematically characterized it in Empire. Neither does it represent a disinterested reality of global do-goodism and benevolence, as is usually suggested in studies purporting to explain the current imperial moment in which we live. Rather, it is a hierarchical notion of power that reterritorializes and recenters global relations within blocks of power through spatial displacement and the redefinition of traditional notions of sovereignty, while we're working and even perfecting the violent and exploitative logics of imperial power that have historically violated the integrity of non-Western societies and still stand in the way of especially African self-determination into diffuse networks of power and privilege. Put differently, the liberal peace is a manifestation of a new imperialistic posture, a reality of imperial globality or post-colonial imperialism. Obviously, these relations of domination are not static and unchanging, neither are they unchallenged or helplessly absorbed, but constantly mutate and are reconstituted through hierarchical modes of power, as well as through appropriating the concerns of anti-colonial forces amid the negation of such imperialistic orders. In the post-9/11 war on terror security environment, this liberal will to power fundamentally reconstituted itself into a naked imperialistic vocation that militarized global relations through the routinization of intervention, covert action, insurgency, or counterinsurgency operation, and drone strike explicitly targeted at regime change as its foil. Increasingly, it appropriated the language of peace, or more appropriately, no war, to define the credibility of its practice. The primary aim of this interventionist impulse and its multiple iterations and forms has been the imposition of its will on society. Is defined. It defines as illiberal, defective, conflictive, disorderly, and so forth, irrespective of whether or not the cause of conflict or disorder in is the liberal interventionism itself. And liberal interventionism always posits itself as the solution. So you look at Libya, for instance, Africa's most prosperous, or one of the most prosperous countries on the continent, was destroyed by liberal interventionism, but the problem is because of Gaddafi is the one that is responsible. So the NATO military action in Libya, for example, is and the blowback which continues to destabilize the Sahel region of Africa constitutes perhaps a paradigmatic example of this increasing liberal military intervention on the continent, which incarnates a spirit of an imperial globalism that normalizes warfare as the primary instrument for pursuing ethical and political agendas, as well as advance a now familiar pattern of heightened militarization of world politics, the banalization of warfare, the globalization of violent interventions, and normalization of violent displacement to the South, especially Africa. What has this got to do with geopolitics? I hope it is clear by now that the picture I am trying to paint is one that is steeped in geopolitics and has geopolitical implications for Africa. For starters, neoliberalism and liberal peace strategies of global are strategies for global domination. Neoliberal ascendancy was primarily targeted at third world solidaristic politics, specifically the historical attempt to suppress third worldism and delegitimate the politics that undergirded it. The conflicts I have suggested also emerged precisely in this context and provided an opportunity for the realization of this historical quest in the first place. Matter of fact, if we take Nixon's abrogation of capital controls and the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile as constitutive moments of the emergence of neoliberalism, and not the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions in 79 and 80, respectively, that cemented it, then we can say that neoliberalism was from its very moment of inception, a global, serving not as not only as an exploitative crisis generating system, but also, at least in relation to Chile, a violent and militaristic practice. Militarism here designates more than simply the process through which a state or society is organized or organizes themselves through a military logic, for example, in real and symbolic investment and practices. Rather, I am referring to the logics and subjection of societies and their functioning to militarized requirements, logics, and practices as mechanisms for governance. The point I am making, in other words, is that militarization and militarizing logics have always already been inbuilt in neoliberal logics. What is the implication for this for Africa? I want to say that Africa have not always helplessly absorbed these dire situations that I have presented here. But in fact, have attempted to redress the state of affairs by, among other things, looking elsewhere. And this is where the emergence of China as a major player is important. Some will even say China is a contender for global hegemony and has tended to provide an alternative reality that is threatening to upset the hegemony of the West on the continent. In the introduction to a book that I recently edited, Recentering Africa in International Relations, I wrong-headedly dismissed categorically the African rising narrative for its superficiality. What I should have said or done instead was to look at the emergence of China and Chinese investment on the continent that ultimately led to the kind of growth that formed the basis of the African rising narrative, which was later appropriated by the liberal West. It is no accident that the United States and Western Europe are indeed further militarizing the continent in order to encircle China, which in a way is suggesting that maybe the continent is once more caught up in the middle of hegemonic struggle. And I want to end with this because I think Professor Carmody referred to China establishing bases. The point though is that if you compare one base of China to the United States, which has over, according to their own count, it's 27 bases, but you could go up to 36. It's not even close. And recently, the US Africa Command started commenting that China establishing a base at Equatorial Guinea, it's actually creating a strategic problem for the United States because China will be able to place missiles there that will target the eastern seaboard of the United States. The point here, though, is that the issue is not what the United States thinks. It's what the opportunity, and Fantu Cheru and Lina Ben Abdullah and Deborah Bottingham have all looked at this and says that the Chinese presence in Africa is actually creating a different kind of infrastructure in terms of financing and investment. Now, this does not mean that China may not have its own economic interest. But like the Chinese premier addressing the African Union in 2014 said, it's actually a mutual beneficial relations. And I'll stop there and maybe revisit this when we come back to questions.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. I have Firoz, who's going to, who's prepared to step in and ask a couple of questions, but perhaps before that, I should just say, Pádraig, do you want to have a step in right now to make any commentary upon Zuba's presentation?
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we give you each a chance to have a discourse, and then we'll open it up for Firoz.
So I think I'm broadly in agreement with what Zuba is saying. I guess he's identified the main point where we differ, which is around the nature of Chinese engagement on the continent. And I suppose if you're thinking about overaccumulation and the dynamics of capital overaccumulation in the West, that also applies in China. So China has sought its own spatial fix of crisis displacement in Africa and elsewhere around the world. And that has been accentuated, or was accentuated, by the stimulus measures that were put in place after the global financial crisis. So I don't know, Zuba, if you know that statistic about more cement was poured in China between 2011 and 2013 than was poured in the US in the whole 20th century. So there was a massive crisis of overaccumulation accentuated by the stimulus measures put in place by the Chinese government after the so-called global financial crisis. And the resolution of that, or one of the attempted resolutions of that, has been through this, what Tim Zajontz calls the infrastructural fix in Africa. So, but in other places as well. So I guess that's our main point of difference, but Zuba identified that himself. So thanks.
Would you like to respond? Or?
Yeah, quickly. I just want to say that I agree with Arigi that it is in vain that we try to view the logics of Chinese economic relations from the pricing of the experiences of the West. I grew up in Sierra Leone. There is this place in Bo, the city that I grew up in. It was called China Farm. Why was it China Farm? Because we would go to China Farm. Basically, the Chinese were in this place developing the traditional African rice yield in Sierra Leone, at least, was 6 months. And the Chinese were experimenting to produce this high yielding short term 3 months, right? So China Farm was actually this place, this agricultural corporation. Secondly, and I'm talking of the 80s when I was a kid. Secondly, the ministerial building in Sierra Leone is known as Yui Building, basically Friendship Building, that was gifted by China, partially because even the Chinese would say the Africans, our African brothers, brought us to the United Nations. So when Professor Carmody, for instance, was saying that China was basically trying to surround itself by African states, well, that was not because of Tiananmen Square. Guinea's entire funding after the French left and took out everything was precisely because of was Chinese investment, of course, the money that was provided by Nkrumah and all of this. The point that I'm trying to make is that, yes, China is in a different place where it has development needs. But when the Chinese premier came to, and I'm making a larger theoretical or general argument, when the Chinese premier came to the African Union, this is what he said, and it has stuck with me. Where it's like, we are aware that in Africa, you are afraid that somebody will come and take something from you. But we have that history too. We know that our development is contingent on yours, and your development is also contingent on ours. We can cooperate. There are things that we legitimately want, and there are things we don't have, but there are things that we have that we could give you. And I know at the African Union, this was like, they were comparing that speech to the speech that Obama gave in Accra, to the speech that John Kerry was giving at the same time, lecturing Africans. You have to place it within the historical context. And I'll end on this. What Fantu Cherry says, it's not China's responsibility to tell African governments what their needs are or how to play their hand in their relations with China. China does not come with any precondition. They tell you this is what we want. And Fantu Cherry's argument, which I buy, is that the onus is on African states to be able to leverage that relationship and say, this is what we want. And finally, and when they do that, so the point that I'm making is that the emergence of China provides the opportunity. And finally, there was this paper that I reviewed for ROPE, was somebody about telecommunication investment in Sierra Leone. The World Bank and the IMF told the Sierra Leonean government, you have to put austerity measures for us to be able to give you a loan of 50 million to broaden and reform your telecommunications industry. This was the APC government, and they had historically have relationship with China, and they said no. They went to China, and China provided this loan. So the point that I'm making is the entrance of China, even in funding, creates a different opportunity that allows African states to be able to measure their own role and play their hand in, if they are really serious about transforming their relation, then there is an opportunity. And the entrance of China, irrespective of what you think of it, that is my own position. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Feroz, are you ready to offer some interrogation here?
Well, I'm certainly ready to make some comments. I was intrigued by Pádraig's just last comment, where he feels that generally he's in agreement with Zubairu, with the exception of how China is defined and its role defined. Because I would have liked to have heard from Pádraig in his presentation more about his analysis of what neoliberalism is. I mean, he started his presentation with the question that people do raise their voices about whether neoliberalism is a valid term and so on. So, because I do think it is at the core of it, because I think it's important to understand China in relation to the intervention of other imperial powers. That includes the US, UK, Europe, and Japan as well. And those were not really explored. So we can't really get a sense of the nature of China's intervention. As far as I know, I don't think, and the two of you may be able to correct me, I'm not aware of Chinese interventions for regime change, for overthrowing governments, for mass killings in Africa, which I would suggest that the UK, US, Europe have indeed been involved in. And this comes back to this issue of that Zubairu raises about neoliberalism and poses the idea that it is the Pinochet coup that should be seen as the starting point of neoliberalism. And in a sense, that would fit with Samir Amin's idea that, in fact, the birth of neoliberalism has to be located in the early 1970s, linked to the disarticulation of the dollar from the gold standard. So there's some sort of consistency there. But I think what I would really like to tease out in this discussion is to break open further what we mean by neoliberalism. Because what Samir Amin pointed out is that in the early 70s was the beginning of that process of neoliberalization. He points out that there was almost 100 years before that the 1870s crisis broke open, which led to a massive imperial intervention, the dividing of the world, and so on. But I do feel that it's necessary to equate neoliberalism with liberalism. Liberalism was born from the loins of enlightenment, and it gave birth to its twin, its conjoined twin, racism. It is no mistake that liberalism was associated with, which gave birth to democracy as a project that was exclusivist. It was an exclusivist project. In the USA, only white male slave owners were allowed to vote. Not even their women folk were allowed to vote. They defined, as has been pointed out, many other people, including Domenico Lesoto, it gave rise to the concept of liberalism being a creation of two spaces: the sacred zones for the privilege, and the sacrifice zones, which is everyone else. I would argue that the birth of neoliberalism is a return to the values, traditions, and mechanisms of liberalism. If colonization was what was its characteristic in the 19th century, today it is neo-colonization of the continent. We cannot talk about militarization without understanding its motive force. What the US or what Europe has done to Somalia, to what it has done to Libya, what it has attempted to do all over the continent, has been to nurture and allow the increased membership of the sacred space to an African elite, while enhancing and expanding and throwing the vast majority of the populations out into the sacrifice zones. The extent to which it is willing to do that it's demonstrated in Libya how you just completely smash a state. You completely destroy it and make it unviable because that expands the sacrifice zones, which is what the core of it is. Because if you can throw people out of livelihood, then you have an elite that can feast and on whatever is left off. And I think that is really important, because we cannot look at neoliberalism and militarization without understanding its underlying motive force. Now, I would agree with Pádraig that we do have China, in terms of capital expansion, an underlying economic imperial aspiration. But I think we have to be, it's not merely the number of military bases that USA has in comparison to China. It is what is being done with those military bases, what is being done in terms of overthrowing regimes, of regime change, and so on. It surprises me that we don't have a discussion here about the threat that is posed to the US and the dollar in this current situation, where the whole dynamics, because of the Ukraine invasion, is creating the conditions for the rise of an alternative currency. Now, currency and money control is so essential. Look at West Africa and Central Africa and the way in which France controls their money with the CFA. The rest of the continent is completely controlled by the dollar. Nobody can trade in any other currency than the dollar. So is that not qualitatively different to what China is doing? Or can we just simply say, let's reduce them all to being imperial? Those are questions which I think needs to be posed.
Pádraig, would you like to offer any comment?
Sure. So I guess I'm not saying China and the US are exactly the same, that they have the same modalities of engagement, that they have the same histories. I guess what I would argue is that China is a capitalist state. It hasn't transcended the laws and contradictions of capitalism. I know Origi wrote about the idea of accumulation without dispossession, but I think we do see substantial dispossession associated with overseas Chinese investments, both in terms of population displacement and ecological dispossession. Just in one example, the China Road and Bridge Corporation took 800,000 cubic meters of sand from a reef off the coast of Mombasa and destroyed it to build the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway. So I think accumulation by dispossession exists in these circuits. China offers different potentialities, has different modes of engagements, and has a variegated capitalism. But nonetheless, it is a highly capitalist state, and in some ways a more capitalist state than the Western liberal democracies, through the kind of forbidding of independent trade unions and so on. And so there's a sharper edge in some instances to the capital accumulation associated with Chinese investment than there is sometimes with Western investment. That doesn't mean that it doesn't offer potentialities, but if you look at the trade relations with Africa, it's neo-colonial. It's taking raw materials, importing manufactured goods, saddling the continent with debt, often unsustainable for infrastructure projects, giving the contracts to Chinese companies, paying sometimes workers into Chinese bank accounts so the taxes aren't paid locally. There's a whole host of extractivist, capitalist, social relations which are at play when we're looking at China in the same way as there are in the Western part. So again, it's not to say there aren't differences. There certainly are, and China has been less militaristic. You know, I think Feroz is absolutely right about that. But that doesn't preclude that it will become more militaristic through time. And again, you know, we've seen, as I kind of mentioned, the emergence of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy and some of the techniques associated with that. But we're in an era of both asymmetric, covert warfare and more direct forms of conflict and violence, and also reconfigured structural violence. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Zuba, would you like to offer some comments before we open it up? I should mention that we are happy to draw some questions from the proverbial floor. If people want to place questions in the chat, that would be one means of doing so, or you can raise your hand at a free moment after Zuba's interjection.
I'll just say something quick. You know, David Harvey is one of the people, like that short book on neoliberalism. He actually says that Deng Xiaoping was one of the key figures of the neoliberal movement. Well, Harvey repudiated towards the end of life of Arrighi. They had this conversation, and Harvey has almost come around in accepting that you cannot reduce China to neoliberalism. And I think that was the point that Feroz was making. Even in Professor Carmody's presentation, he says the trade unions continue, although it is the interesting choice of word is the trade unions hold sway with the Communist Party. But those cooperatives, those trade unions are locally embedded. The point that I am trying to make is that there is a way, if we take, what's his name? I'm forgetting his name, but why is this name escaping me? Anyway, the Great Transformation, what's this guy's name?
Polanyi.
If we take Polanyi, the way in which society or the markets are embedded in society, that's how the Chinese society is compared to, and I'll give you an example. In Canada, you remember, Toby, the crisis that led to the resignation of the justice minister. What was that crisis? Canadian firms were doing like untoward stuff in Libya and different places. And this lady wanted, based on the oath that she is taking, to prosecute them. The government protects capital, to the point that there was a crisis in which Trudeau almost lost power. In China, it's the Chinese government that is telling DR Congo and all of these countries, prosecute them, and we will prosecute them here. Another example is during Ebola, when there was that racist incident of Africans in China. What did the Chinese government do? Like basically intervene very quickly. But those kinds of incidents do not happen. So the point is that what is the relationship between capital and the state? The point is the state or capital in China is subjected to state control. You can't say, whereas in the neoliberal movement, and this is the point that Feroz was making, in the neoliberal movement, it's actually the state that is subjected to the control of capital. And we saw that, I just gave the example. In fact, in the election of Donald Trump, that blurry line between the capitalist class and the political class got fused, where a billionaire actually got elected as president And so, no, I don't think that the logic upon which China operates is the same as the logic upon which neoliberal capitalism in the West operates. And in relation to Africa, we have to historicize that relationship. And I'll end on this. It doesn't mean that China's need has not changed or will not change over time. But the point here is that it is creating an opportunity. One, it's based on a completely different kind of relationship. That is one. Two, and more importantly for the geostrategic and geopolitical questions that we are raising, it creates an opportunity for the same thing with the war in Ukraine. It's terrible that people are dying and Russia invaded Ukraine, but for the current moment, at least from an African situatedness, where one power or a group of states determine the trajectory and the destiny of other states, I think this moment, it's actually significant because it has the potential of breaking open that very closed system. And finally, I will say this. The fact that the United States and the EU can do to Russia for what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and Russia cannot do comparable, or even China cannot do comparable to the United States and Western Europe for invading Iraq or Libya, tells you exactly where global power lies. I'll end there.
I'm available to take questions from the floor. In the meantime, I will just maybe point out sort of three dimensions here that I think haven't received as much attention. The first is I'm wondering, if you look at the kinds of engagement that take place, that China is involved in, one of them, of course, is the dispersal of small arms. And I'm wondering if that, in fact, on its own is a determining factor in current conflicts in the present day. There'd be no discussion of the ways that private contractors play into the conflicts on the continent, and I'm thinking particularly of this, the use of the notion of a distributed empire, which Samir al-Baluchi and Medina Tahir have proposed as meaningful, where you see differentially distributed opaque networks of technologies and actors that augment the reach of war on terror. And wondering, on that basis, is there any comparison between the U.S. empire and China? And then thirdly, I think perhaps most importantly is to talk about alternatives in this conjuncture. And I'm more nervous that Zuba's assertion of there being an opportunity for engagement of a different sort with China can potentially obfuscate possibilities for local actors who might see that Chinese engagement as potentially more than it actually is, and of a different nature. I'm not so sure the literature supports that insofar as, we have seen China really increasingly engaging in global institutions on the very terms of those institutions, such as the World Trade Organization, that they're not challenging those fundamental basis of global organization of power. That said, in what clear, concrete cases do we have of Africans struggling against this kinds of the processes of militarization, and in this point, I'm nervous that the return to resource nationalism among some African nations, and there are some efforts to sort of build sovereign wealth funds, but do they then get managed by an elite that is fundamentally at ease with the capitalist logics of statecraft that nurture and allow increasing growth of an African elite, while there's little resistance or from the populations, and I'm wondering if we could sort of turn towards a lens towards possibilities of alternatives.
I will just say, if you allow me, Lina Ben Abdallah actually published a paper recently in which she makes this fantastic argument that, and to your point, and it's a fair point, right? That what China is doing, it's actually trying to work within the existing structures without unruffling the boat, although the war in Ukraine has placed China in a difficult situation. And so it is becoming more assertive in actually stating its own position in relation to the United States and Western Europe and NATO and stuff, right? But Lina Ben Abdallah's argument, and I basically agree, share her concerns as well, that China has been very delicate in trying to play this balancing act, right? In working within those institutions, but also maintaining its own specific logic of approaching the way. So you don't want to destroy the institutions necessarily, but to transform them as you emerge. And also don't forget that part of the reason is China is, the reason why we're taking China even seriously, it's not its military might, it's really because of the economic transformation that it has been able to undertake. So that is one. And my friend Bikram Gill will say, the Chinese Communist Revolution, no matter how you think of it, and the question of land, it's central to it. So when we take Zimbabwe, and I'll bring Zimbabwe. So for instance, he will take India and China, Zimbabwe and South Africa. We are in this place where, of course, the agrarian question was settled with the end of apartheid, and Mandela and others accepted that, you know, it's willing seller, willing buyers, right? And then by the 2000s, we have this idea of the global land grab, in which Africa becomes this place. And everybody was saying what had happened in Zimbabwe was just because Mugabe was authoritarian. The problem with these kinds of analysis is the failure, and Mamdani makes this argument in Citizen and Subject, is the failure to understand that the state, local peasant forces are capable of holding the state accountable. So in Zimbabwe, Mugabe realized he was going to lose power because of those demands. But nobody takes that into consideration and becomes, and Ian Scones, who is not a fan of Mugabe, when Sam Moyo was writing about this, everybody was like, Moyo is a fan of Mugabe, he's an apologist of authoritarian, but Moyo never gave a quarter. It's like, I can't be critical of Mugabe, but at the same time understand that there is an agrarian question and land question in Zimbabwe. So he was writing it and they were dismissing him, including a former professor of mine, John Saul and Richard Saunders, all of them, they dismissed him, and Mamdani. What happened? Ian Scones, who has nothing to do with the regime, actually went and did a study and realized that whatever it is that they were saying, the land redistribution in Zimbabwe actually did work. And so my friend Bikram's, and Toby, I'm sure you know Bikram, the argument he's making is that the Chinese development or the transformation of the Chinese economy is based precisely in the land and agrarian question. And we have to revisit that. So that is the one thing. The second thing is in relation to Africa, Deborah Bottingham has made this argument actually taking a look at Chinese investment. And she has no reason to be, she's not a fan of China. It's not somebody like me. I grew up, so if I write, you will say, oh, he has always liked China. But she's not like me. She took a look at Chinese investment, and the conclusion is that Chinese investment in Africa is fundamentally different. And these are experts who've done work on this, just like Professor Carmody. They are approaching it from a different point. Now, one thing that I want to say, it doesn't mean that that's not upsetting the particular kind of local dynamics on the ground. The argument that I'm making is at the larger structural level, and the opportunity is great. So in Sierra Leone, for instance, the Chinese business enterprises have been stealing the local Gara cloth, like the kind of cloth that you are wearing, for instance, Toby. And then they take it to China and mass produce it, and then bring it back to the market. So there is that aspect as well that is killing local industry, right? To the point that people even like the Chinese cloth, they make fun of it, they call it PRSP. You know what PRSP is, right? Because but Fantu Cheru's point, and I'm sure that's the point that Feroz was getting at, and the point that I will make as well, that if the African states were to prioritize, and you saw that, well, not with Abiy, but when Melis was in power, the kind of developmental state that he was putting in practice was modeled on the Chinese, but also in relation to the particular kind of cooperation that unfortunately that project has ended. Now we are in the neoliberal movement in Ethiopia that is leading to violence and war and all. Anyway, I'll stop there. But the point that I'm making is the claim that the literatures do not bear support to the claim that I am making may not be accurate, because there are lots and lots of studies there that are showing. It doesn't mean that China is an angel. Of course, they have interest and they want to develop their economy. But the point that I'm making is they create a completely different architecture of engagement. And that any people who have actually studied it reach that conclusion. I'm talking about Lina Ben Abdullah. I'm talking about Deborah Bottingham. Bikram. I'm talking about Fantu Cheru. This is the conclusion that they come up with.
Thank you so much for the fascinating response. Zuba, Pádraig, do you want to join in before? I have 2 or 3 more questions that have been posted in the chat, so sure. Let's make sure we leave some room. Feroz.
Sure. Yeah, whichever.
Sorry, Feroz, did you want to step in quickly? You're muted.
Yes, if you don't mind, because I have to leave in a moment. I think one of the dangers of the kind of conversations that are going on is this thing about African agency. What do we mean by that? What it seems to be everyone's talking about is state agency. But the reality of our world in Africa is that we have in every country an elite which is fundamentally part of that international capitalist class. It's linked to all these transnational corporations. It is they are members of a sacred space. The rest of the population, apart from this middle class allies, are part of the sacrifice zones. What about their agency? What about the agency of ordinary working people in Africa, not simply the state? Because the state does not necessarily, regrettably, does not necessarily represent the interest of the majority. And if one thinks otherwise, then one has I think, a delusional idea about the nature of democracy in our countries.
Okay.
Would you like to come in for a minute there,
yes,
Toby?
Please do. Yes.
So just to say, Anita Plummer has a great book coming out about China in Kenya, where she shows that actually the Kenyan public is very effective in holding the Kenyan state to account. So around all sorts of different projects around building of new coal-fired power plants and getting those revoked, or environmental protection, a whole host of issues. So I think we need to be careful when we're talking about these things. You know, we need to be context sensitive and specific. And So that's one thing. Just if I can come back, I know it's maybe getting a little bit tired, but on the kind of neoliberalism China question, I think China plays a multi-level game where it promotes external neoliberalization. At the World Economic Forum in 2017, Xi Jinping got up and kind of promoted himself and China as the guarantors, protectors of free markets around the world, at the same time as it exercises kind of mercantilist policies, protects its own economy. So there's quite a sophisticated, discursive, multi-level game which is being played. So just to kind of be aware of that complexity as well. These terms, neoliberalism, we can use them in very kind of broad brushstrokes, but they're actually locally constituted in many ways and variegated externally and internally.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read out some questions. One that comes from Eve Namakula. She says, thanks for the presentation. Why Africa has always been to be acted upon. We need to agree that no external power or the privileged zones has Africa's interests at heart, given that neoliberalism is founded on capitalism, is about accumulation for the West or China. How can we strengthen Africa's agency from the sacrificed zones? And then we have also a question from Femi. Is there more that Africa should be doing with its agency in the shifting geopolitics and the tug and pull between the West and imperial powers? Is the non-aligned movement approach hurting Africa and limiting its long-term political and economic development, considering the changing dynamics between global powers beyond the war in Ukraine, for instance?
I suppose, again, African state elites are very effective at exercising their agency, but they're effective at exercising their agency oftentimes to reproduce conditions of dependence from which they benefit, both materially, potentially, and politically. So again, I think we need to be careful of the idea that there is an Africa with a unified kind of interest that can be expressed, and that Africa has agency. Obviously, if you're talking about the African Union or something, that's different. Toby, you're back there now. Just on Feroza's point about Kenya as a democracy, that wasn't what I was saying. I didn't say Kenya was a democracy. What Anita Plummer shows in the book is that the state, even if it is repressive in some or many ways, is nonetheless responsive to public opinion and mobilization. And I suppose her point is, it's not that China is some kind of untrammeled giant which is able to come in and ride roughshod over populations, but the state mediates those relationships. So I think that's all I want to say, really.
The pretend Marxist in me is basically saying we have to be careful also, because Marx will say we create history, but not necessarily under our own, under conditions that we like, right? And so this whole notion of agency, sometimes like what happened in Pakistan, was that agency? You have millions of people, or was it an imperial machination that wanted to punish a prime minister that did not go? Of course, there are local forces. Our societies are fractured. Every society is fractured. But the way in which that played out, was it just like people got up one day and said, we're going to get rid of Imran Khan, or was it? So we have to be careful. It's not just the elites, even on the ground. What exactly do we mean when we are talking about agency? That is the first thing that I want to say. And yes, with the first question, I will agree. Africans do not, and I think in my presentation, I actually did mention that, do not just helplessly absorb the conditions. In fact, there is a ventriloquism of neoliberalism, and I think Pádraig was referring to that in terms of the complex politics and complex discursive formations and balancing acts that has to take place depending on different actors, right? So neoliberalism has this particular form of ventriloquism. On the one hand, it generates a crisis, and on the other, it legislates itself as the panacea for that crisis. And I think I did attend to that. And we have to bear in mind that this is what happens. In terms of, I edited this book that I referred to in my presentation, Recentering African International Relations. And that's the entire argument that we were making, that you cannot reduce African agency only to that of reactive, almost like the structural realist argument that says it is the external pressure that is on states that make them react to external stimuli. No, people on the ground in the country, even if you want to say that the elite is discredited, but elite forces everywhere have certain interests. And sometimes you also have to manage that interest in relation to the wider population, especially when it comes to, even if you say these are procedural democracies that exist in the continent. But the point that I want to make, though, is that the African countries are not just haplessly sitting there. Sometimes, like in the case of the case that I know the most, is the Sierra Leonean case, the country that I am originally from. And I know, for instance, that when Ernest Nkrumah was in power, the APC government, they were the ones who were actually dictating or mapping out areas that they wanted to cooperate with. When BO came in power, some of the agreement between the Chinese in terms of building a new airport, they scrapped that. So it's not like these governments are just crazy and they just say, no, they scrapped it. But at the same time, that government that was able to scrap that relationship with China that airport building of a new airport and infrastructure program with China were the same government that could not maintain their foreign policy practice of over 60 years when it came to voting in the United Nations General Assembly. I was like raising questions to the foreign minister. I'm like, why didn't you abstain? Not because what is going on in Ukraine is not terrible, but if there is any area in Sierra Leonean policy that has remained consistent over the past 60 years, it's foreign policy, which is non-aligned. And yet you went and voted, and people were like, well, the Americans were basically threatening us. So again, this is why I'm saying that the notion of agency, but also the way in which they state, you have to situate it within the context, historical context of global power relations, contemporary context, but also the ventriloquism of these very hierarchical power relations that we are talking about. Anyway, I'll end it there.
I think what you just stated opens up a whole number of questions in my mind, Zuba, about the nature of international order. And of course, right now, this is in this moment where the UN looks like an increasingly incapable body that has really never sufficiently served the interests of Africans. I wonder if there can be some kind of fomentation of a new Bandung moment that comes into being alongside that questioning of the validity of the UN, and maybe we do need a new internationalist movement to push for differing structural relations between portions of the world. But what I think we should be doing right now is closing up, and I can offer some final moments of comment, but I do want to bring people's attention to the call for papers that I believe I put into the chat section of the meeting. But we can also, and I'll do it one more time, and we'll circulate it as well through Institute of African Studies channels. But please read the call for papers, and I'm hoping that some of those in attendance here feel inspired enough to jump into the discussion by offering us a submission. We're trying to push people to provide some abstracts for proposed papers by the end of May, I think was our date. The specific dates I'll follow up with. and we're looking for final papers. Oh, yeah, June 1st, and we're looking for final papers by the end of August. So it would require people to move quickly if they haven't already been working on something that can engage on this discussion. But we see the urgency of it, and we hope that others will agree and take part. And of course, both Zuba and Pádraig, we would love to have your contribution involved in that issue as well. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules right now, as grading and final end of term processes consumes those in the academy. We realize your time is very valuable, and so thank you immensely. I'll just give a moment if anybody else wants to jump in. Otherwise, we'll. And there, a question about a recording. There will be a recording made available and posted on future emails sent out by the Institute of African Studies at Carleton.
Okay, can I just, you mentioned something about the new Bandung. Arigi, before the end of his life, actually the argument that he's making, that the problem with Bandung was there was not really a strong material base. I think he's too optimistic. I share some of his arguments, and so for him, China provides the material base for a new Bandung. And the rise of China is precisely that. And he rejects the idea that China is neoliberal. And it's kind of crazy because David Harvey came along to doubt his own conviction about China being, right? That it's a different kind of, so for Arigi, part of the problem with Bandung was, of course, a solidaristic movement that did not have a material base. And we are in a place where, for the first time in 500 years, a non-Western power is posed to become a global hegemon. Whether that they are able to pull that off is something else. But that itself, for somebody like me, is significant. Because the irrespective of Chinese interests, I won't assume that China is going to behave the way in which the United States or the UK or France or the Western European countries have been behaving over the centuries. I don't think that is a possibility. Partially because these societies are also grounded within certain kinds of historical memory and historical practice. And if you go back to millennia of Chinese history, you understand that it's now, part of its practice is, of course, it's a different kind of existing in the present, but some of it is also looking back to historically how it has existed. And I think, but I'll end on this, I just think that we live in a moment of rapid hegemonic transformation. And I actually think, I'll end on this, that whatever is happening in Ukraine, even though people want to go back to 2008 to Putin's address at the Munich Security Conference, I actually think that Libya is very significant. It was a significant moment when China and Russia decided that maybe this regime change has gone too far. And once it happened in 2014 in Russia, in Ukraine, then, and so I think we are in a place where with the transformations that are taking place, the world is in flux. It could go either way. But for me, the possibility that a unipolar movement could come to an end and that there will be a southern power that rises that will give us maybe an opportunity. Maybe this is unfounded, but that will give us an opportunity to understand the world and engage it in a different way. Is something that I'm looking forward to, and I'll end there.
I suppose for me, great kind of unknown that we haven't really talked about in all of this is climate change and what that is going to do to global geopolitics. Because, you know, if the wet bulb temperature rises above 35 Celsius, and apparently large parts of China, that's what it's going to be on track for, will become uninhabitable. And obviously there are parts of Africa that will become uninhabitable. And what will that mean for kind of securitizing the impacts of climate change? What will it mean for conflict and for great power rivalry and the struggle for resources and all of those kinds of things? So I think you're right, you know, Zuba's right. We're in an era of transformation, and that's probably maybe the biggest one that's coming down the pike at us. In terms of the question that Jose Maria has put there, Zuba was saying, you know, about liberal interventionism, that it's kind of a structure, and I'm not doing justice to the way you put it much better than I'm putting it, that it's a will to power, and it's kind of thought out. Personally, I wouldn't see it like that, I think, necessarily. So I think in the Libyan case, I think obviously the NATO had incredible military force that it was able to deploy. To me, I think they saw a kind of humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Libya and decided to intervene militarily, and that went to the extent of regime change. The kind of mission creeped, and then subsequent to that, there was a doctrine initiated which said, we're not going to replace regimes around the world until we can be absolutely sure what will replace them. So that's why I think you see the Obama regime adopt a much more hands-off approach in the Syrian conflict, for example. So that's what Herman Cohen kind of argues in his recent book about US policy towards Africa. So again, it's hard to know with either China or the US what goes through the minds of policymakers, and we as academics can try and judge from what we see on the ground or in the media or through our reading. But the intentionality question is an important one, and reading intentionality off structure, backward reading of intentionality off structure, I think is difficult. And so I would be more open to the idea that kind of emotions play a much bigger role in a lot of this than we often give credit for if we're using kind of structural analysis. So just to kind of comment on that, and that kind of, I suppose, in terms of addressing the question, you know, I suppose it's talking about the securitization of neoliberalism, that neoliberalism generates and is implicated in conflict through the accentuation of inequality, poverty, and environmental degradation. And then there's an attempt to kind of securitize or repress the effects that, as Zuba rightly says, it has produced itself.
To be quick to this, I think, yes, we will never be able to know the intentionality, but I think, you know, when I was doing literature in school and in university, they will ask a question that says, but from what they say, what others say about them and what they do, construct a character sketch of this person and this person. This was a typical question that they will ask in my literature classes. And I will say, when we are looking at global events, history is our guide. The pronouncements of those policymakers is our guide. Of course, we're in a position where we are capable of speculating. Hillary Clinton's email exchanges that was put out by WikiLeaks clearly shows that NATO involvement in Libya was not humanitarian. If anything, we now know, and even Obama accepted, that it was a mistake. Norway did not know anything about Libya when they joined into bombing Libya. So no, that idea, the same thing is happening right now with Ukraine. what Russia is doing is terrible, but nobody is allowed to even have an alternative view of what is happening. Everything the Ukrainian government says, everybody accepts, oh, Russia is committing war crimes, even though the Russians have been so restrained compared to the Americans in Libya or Afghanistan or Iraq. So the point that I'm making here is that no, is it Jose Marie? You are right. It's not only the securitization of conflict. For instance, the problem that we have in the Sahel is a blowback of what happened in Libya. We bombed that country, we destabilized it. Before you know it, these people were saying they were concerned about human rights, but slave markets were showing up in Libya. And then the arms, the same thing is, the same dynamic is replacing in Ukraine, by the way. They are arming the Ukrainians, and some of that weapon is ending up in the black markets. And right now, before you know it, Eastern Europe or Western Europe is going to be threatened by different kinds of armed movement and stuff. Neoliberal interventions were actually underpin the conflicts that emerged in Africa in the 90s. And the response to those conflicts and the militarization of those responses is now responsible for also awashing the continent with different kinds of insecurities. I'll stop there.
It's very powerful, Zuba. Thank you so much. And at this point, we've kept everybody going for 5 minutes short of 2 hours. So thank you all so much. Other thank yous are coming in, so please read the chat stream. This has really been extremely rich, and I'm leaving with more questions than I've come with. So thank you so much. That's a material that we can mull over and engage, and look forward to doing so with more of you in the future. Thank you very, very much. Thank you also to Femi at the IAS, without whose work this would not have been possible.